into the mountain regions of northern Italy in order to avoid total annihilation. They survived over the centuries, and many of them eventually joined the Protestant Reformation movement in the 16th century. It's interesting to note that many of Rome's quote-unquote saints came out of these Dominican and Franciscan orders, which were involved with the Inquisition. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Albert the Great were Dominicans, and St. Bonaventure was a Franciscan. It's sickening how Rome would canonize and exalt men who were involved in orders which oversaw the torture and death of massive amounts of Bible believers and others. The medieval Inquisition did not stop there. In AD 1484, Pope Innocent VIII produced the bull Summis Desiderantis Affectibus, wherein he authorized inquisitors to find, try, and murder alleged witches. In this so-called Great Witch Hunt, intellectual arguments meant to persuade the person of their error were not utilized by inquisitors. Instead, the goal was to extract a confession by torture and then murder those rumored to be alleged witches. It was believed by the Catholics that a witch could not cry from pain, and since those tortured cried, the papal inquisitors claimed the devils must have made them cry as a trick to convince everyone they were not a witch. The inquisitors would often shave the bodies of alleged witches, including the private parts, since Catholic superstition at that time said that witches would 1. Hide objects of witchcraft in their hair or private parts, and 2. That witches had a birthmark or scar which would function as a teat to feed milk or blood to imps or the devil himself. Inquisitors would therefore stab alleged witches on their scars or birthmarks with needles, since they claimed a witch would not bleed if their witch's teat was pierced. However, when the people did bleed, the torturers claimed Satan allowed the bleeding to make it appear the person was not a witch. They then resorted to torture such as putting hot boiling fat in the person's eyes, underarms, and thighs, which many times led to infection or death. In Germany, alleged witches who were tortured into confession then had hot irons put on their breasts and arms, their right hand cut off, their body burnt at the stake, and their ashes thrown into the river. Most of these accused witches were simply social outcasts the community did not like, or women who were poor, unmarried, elderly, pale, or wrinkly. Tens of thousands of alleged witches were murdered in the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition. Just when one thinks it could not possibly get any worse, they encounter the second phase of Inquisition, known as the Spanish Inquisition. The Council of Tortosa in 1429 showed that certain Jews were conversos, that is, those who outwardly confessed Catholicism, but were not getting their children baptized and were still practicing Jewish feasts and attending the synagogue. The Council of Basel also confirmed this was taking place. In 1478, Queen Isabella of modern-day Spain and her husband Ferdinand appealed to Pope Sixtus IV, who reigned from AD 1471 to 1484, to establish Inquisition. Pope Sixtus IV agreed and issued the bull Exigit Sinceras Devotionis Affectus, which promulgated the investigation as to whether or not converted Jews and others were secretly continuing to practice their original religion. Historian Williston Walker remarks, "The Spanish Inquisition especially concerned itself with rooting out those Jewish and Muslim converts who had supposedly lapsed from the faith and with maintaining purity of blood in all offices of state and church. It was also to deal harshly with Spanish Protestants and all those suspected of Lutheranism." The way this Inquisition was set up was that 3 Catholic priests would be appointed to a tribunal being selected by Queen Isabella and Ferdinand. In 1480, 2 Catholic Dominicans were given this role, namely Juan de San Martin and Miguel de Murillo. Their advisor was Juan de Medina. As the plan progressed, there were too many prisoners in the common-containing area, and so they had to be moved to gloomy dungeons for Inquisition. On February 6, 1481, 6 months after this tribunal was established, 6 conversos accused of heresy were publicly burnt to death after a Catholic named Friar Alfonso de Ojeda first gave a grisly sermon to the masses. The papacy then appointed 7 more inquisitors. In 1482, more Inquisition tribunals were set up in Cordoba, and in 1483, even more were set up in Jaén and Ciudad Real. Schaff notes, quote, "According to a contemporary, by November 4, 1491, 298 persons had been committed to the flames. In regards to the tribunal in Pt.2 Real, Schaff relays that within 2 years it had 52 heretics burnt, and in Avila, from 1490 to 1500, 75 were burnt alive and 26 dead bodies were exhumed and burned. In the 1480s, many conversos fled to Portugal to escape Inquisition. However, in 1536, the Inquisition found its way even there. In his work, The Grand Inquisitor's Manual, Jonathan Kirsch relays that, quote, Protestants joined the Jewish and Muslim conversos as principal targets of the Spanish Inquisition. In 1533, a priest who was charged with the seduction of a nun sought to appease the inquisitors by offering them the names of 70 men and women whom he denounced as Lutheran heretics. The first Protestant burned for heresy by the Spanish Inquisition went to the stake in 1540, and 26 of the 30 accused heretics at the auto at Toledo in 1559 were Protestants. The procedures of Inquisition at this time were as follows, as developed by the Inquisitors General Thomas D. Torquemada. First, there was accusation. Any civilian could level an accusation of heresy or immorality against another, and it would result in a tribunal. Even if no citizen accused anyone, inquisitors could freely accuse citizens. Abuses crept in since the wealthy were often targeted by inquisitors since their wealth would be confiscated and go towards funding Inquisition. Second, there was detention. Once accused, the person was detained and their property was seized temporarily, depending on the outcome of the tribunal. Detention often lasted months. Families of the detained were not informed, which often resulted in women and children of the family not being able to survive without the man of the house around. Thirdly, after detention came interrogation. The goal was to gain a confession and pass a sentence. There was no intention of convincing the accused of the error of their alleged heresy or immorality. There were many methods of torture used to gain a confession, including the following. There was the garrucha or strappado, which was a suspension system which had ropes, weights, and pulleys. The victims' arms were tied behind their back. They were hoisted in the air, and then they were dropped. They were stopped in midair right before hitting the ground, so that the weights tied to their ankles caused great pain and dislocation. There was also the taca, which was basically waterboarding, where a cloth was put over the victim's mouth and water poured in, resulting in the victim feeling like they were drowning. Also utilized was the potro, or rack. The victim was placed on this device and their arms and legs were severely stretched, causing excruciating tearing of the muscles and dislocation. In 1591, Pablo Garcia, the secretary of the Suprema in Madrid, wrote instructions on how this torture was to be carried out. He stated, quote, If the prisoner should die or be injured or suffer heavy bleeding or have a limb mutilated during the torture, this will be their fault and responsibility and not ours, because they have refused to tell the truth. Fourthly, after interrogation through torture came hearings and trial. Fifthly, you had sentencing. Acquittals were very rare in Spanish Inquisition. When found guilty, the victim was handed over to the secular authorities for burning at the stake. Burnings were usually like festivities where Catholics in the community would watch and be entertained. The ritual began with a mass and then a public procession of the victim. Instances of burning heretics during the Spanish Inquisition lasted into the late 18th century. In his 2007 work, Inquisition, The Reign of Fear, Toby Green remarks on the statistics of the Spanish Inquisition, quote, The Inquisition was at its most severe in Spain during the first 50 years after its formation in 1478, when it is estimated that 50,000 people were tried, a significant proportion as religiados burnt at the stake. In some years, such as 1492, 2,000 people may have been relaxed in person, and another 2,000 burnt in effigy. Approximately 700 people were put to death in Seville alone between 1481 and 1488, and another 50 in Pt.2 Real between 1483 and 1484. In the Crown of Aragon, meanwhile, roughly 1,000 people were relaxed between 1485 and 1530. Between 1540 and 1700, 84,000 people were tried. In the reign of Philip V, there was a rekindling of violence after the War of the Spanish Succession finished in 1714, with 1,463 trials, with 111 executions. In Portugal, there were approximately 45,000 trials between 1536 and 1767, including 13,667 in Goa, with at least 1,543 people being relaxed.